Welcome to Volume 1 of the event series Data in a Downturn. Over the last few months, I've seen tons of data professionals talking about the economic downturn and how it might affect us as data professionals. And it inspired this event series, like I said, Data in a Downturn. And the first guest that I wanted to bring on is Mark Menatti, who was my data team manager at our previous company, Homey. And he's seen at least two, maybe three economic downturns in the past, and he's just going to teach us a bit about what he's experienced, and maybe we'll learn something about how to navigate the current one. And the goal of this event is definitely not to use scare tactics or try to get clickbait or have hot takes. Really, the goal is just to learn from someone who's walked the walk like Mark about previous downturns. The other goal is to get actionable insights on how to navigate the current downturn as data professionals. And lastly, to ask Mark whatever questions you have. On the right side of your screen, you will see that there's a Q&A section. And in there, you can write whatever question you have for Mark. And then we will bring it on screen at the appropriate time for Mark to answer. And before we dive in, just to let you know, this event is brought to you by the Operational Analytics Club, and that is a community of data professionals. We are building an incubator for the future of data professionals. So whether you are an experienced data professional looking to gain strategic skills, or you're the first data hire at your company looking to network with data professionals who have experienced the problems that you're facing right now, or you're just a data professional looking to network and job hunt, the Operational Analytics Club is for you. And I will add a link to that at the top of your screen. Boom, right up top. If you go to operationalanalytics.club, you can submit a form and join. And lastly, this event is recorded, so if you have to drop off, don't worry. We will send you an email later today that has all the content. So with no further ado, Mark Menatti, thank you very much for joining. I know you very well, but the people attending do not. Could you please introduce yourself, and then we'll dive into the questions.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Parker. I appreciate you having me on today. So I'm currently the director of data science at the agency real estate, which is kind of a combo, kind of high-end luxury boutique real estate brokerage, and also a reality TV production company.
Didn't know
And
that
I've
part.
been here. Yeah, it's a really kind of unique group, and it creates some really strange data. Honestly, just kind of what our client base is and who we work with is really fascinating. So I've been here for about a year. Before that, I was at Homey. I was the senior director of analytics and data there. The prior 8 years before Homey, I was at USANA and had kind of a handful of titles there, the last one being the director of BI and data science. And I've been doing this stuff for a while. And just kind of reading over your topics here, I feel like at least part of the conversation today is how many different ways can you say that I'm old without actually saying that I'm old? So, I appreciate that. But I've been in data for a
I'll use
while.
not young. That'll be better. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, that's different. But I've been in data for a while. It kind of happened almost by accident because what the industry is today just sprang up while I was employed, and there was work to be done, and I just kind of started to do it. And that's really kind of been the direction that my career has gone. So anyway, that's kind of a bit of my background.
Great. Thank you very much. And I have prepared about 10 questions. We're going to go through some of those, but as you guys add questions to the Q&A, we'll answer those as well. So the first one I have for you, Mark, is what was your experience as a data professional during the Great Recession?
Yeah, so I think we can talk about some things that went well and some things that didn't. So that was my first data job, my first actual data job. I was hired by a London-based investment company. We bought and sold microcap stocks on the London Stock Exchange, kind of sub-exchange. And I was hired on to be a financial analyst, but it ended up being a data job because I discovered that the Bloomberg terminal had an API, and I could utilize that to automate and scale really everything they brought me in there to do. And so, from that standpoint, right, this idea of kind of having a tool that wasn't there before and using it was nice, and it really kind of pushed my career in a certain direction. But the downside, and this will become important later on, was everyone that I knew in my field worked in London. And so when unemployment kind of started to ramp up and I was inevitably and eventually kind of laid off by this company, I didn't know anyone where I lived. Remote work really wasn't much of a thing then. And so even though I'd had this experience that was valuable for me, that I had kind of learned and grown a lot, I didn't really have people that I knew that trusted me. And that matters a whole hell of a lot. And so, like, as far as kind of the Great Recession is concerned, kind of I went into it the way that an analytics professional went into things in the early 2000s and 90s and stuff like that. I mean, I did the math and economics as an undergraduate. I had an MBA, worked in banking, worked for kind of the investment company. And I didn't really understand at that point that the whole world was changing. So a couple things that I kind of toss out there, stuff that was the case then, and I think is still the case now. Right? Is in 2008 when the recession started, a lot of people were laid off. A lot of kind of job changes happened, but the effect went a lot longer than that. So a lot of people, if they had to take a job for less pay, which I did at one point, or in a field that they weren't super interested in, they might have been ticked off that like unemployment line because they're technically employed, but they're still looking to move, right? And so even though we see the big hits to unemployment happening early, there's an overall kind of ripple effect that happens a long time after that, with people continuing to change, continuing to look for opportunities that are kind of more aligned to what they were doing before, and also new opportunities kind of springing up out of nowhere. I mean, just I learned SQL with that company. That wasn't a thing that I came out expecting to learn, right? So anyway, as far as that experience goes, it went longer than I think people realize. They think 2008 is when it happened, but even in like 2011 and early 2012, I'd apply for jobs and I'd get through maybe a couple rounds of interviews, and I had a couple hiring managers at the end that would come out and say, "Well, we have 4 or 5 candidates now that we're interviewing at this stage, and all of them had my exact same friggin' resume." you know and so it was just kind of a slower move. It was frustrating on a personal side as well. That whole process can be demoralizing. It was also short term, but it was hard to see that in the moment when it was all happening.
And did were you on a data team, or were you the only data hire at that company during the
I
Great
mean,
Recession?
I was. It was a startup investment company. They ended up getting like a 20 to 30 million pound portfolio, but I was the analyst.
Okay. And did you become more important to the organization during the recession, or less important? Like when things were getting a
Yeah.
little less stable, were you more valuable or less valuable?
So a lot of that stuff depends on the company that you work for. I mean, in my
Mm-hmm.
particular case, that company's big investment model was very simple. Like, it took me a couple of years to figure out every part of it, but once I did, it was very simple. They were doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. And so after I had taken the time to automate it all, I became significantly less important. Just, yeah, like, I wasn't an accountant. That wasn't my skill set. What I was good at was math and predicting things. And once all that was in code in their model, there really wasn't a ton of work outstanding. So that was kind of my experience then. More broadly, a lot of people that are kind of at the top of these companies that are making decisions come from a background of sales, and there's good reasons for that, right? Because we need revenue, and if someone can generate revenue, they're super important. But what that means from an analytics standpoint, right, is they don't come from the background that we came from, and they don't necessarily see the value in it that we believe is there. And it can vary a lot from company to company, and there's ways to kind of sell that and to demonstrate it. But like the people that got there because they were successful doing what they were doing. And in times of stress, it's easy to go to kind of what you know and what you're comfortable with. And so, I think on average, I'd say like we're looked at as, unless we are directly supporting a revenue operation, and that can look a number of different ways in terms of kind of influencing customers or optimizing supply chains and making sure that we can deliver stuff that we've sold, or just on the financial side, if you're building kind of fraud models and things like that, right, that there's an actual kind of dollar value applied to. Those roles kind of continue to be valuable, but on the actual kind of strategy and analytics side, it can be tough for a while. At least that's been my experience.
And talking about revenue, there's a couple questions that have come in. I'm going to throw this one in to the screen. So, any advice to scope out analytics projects that yield revenue for the company? Thanks for the question, Minhas.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, we've got a handful of questions here. So, as far as kind of scoping out projects, and this is a thing that honestly every company I've worked at, I want to understand who the customer is, and what facilitates a sale and what doesn't, right? Usually companies don't necessarily have that background from kind of a data standpoint, but that's a story that resonates with people, right? Like if you can go to someone who's at a high level at a company, and again, often your CEO is a salesperson, and be able to kind of demonstrate why a sale either did or didn't occur, and then kind of take it a step further and be able to kind of recommend things that you can do to facilitate more. That tends to be pretty compelling. So, I think the question was, how do you scope it out? And the answer is, well, what's your business model, right? Like what are your kind of biggest variables in terms of either driving the top line or, in some cases where your top line, like I'm in real estate right now, right? And so we're like highly susceptible to changes in the overall industry. And so there's a question of, well, okay, how do you get more efficient, right? Even if you kind of know that the top line is going to have a tougher time for a while. So as far as kind of how you scope it out, the answer is understanding your business model. I would recommend talking with leaders in different groups, particularly the ones that drive revenue, get a feel for, what they think is happening. There's a lot of kind of like, it seems like it's widely believed that, in data roles, our job is to tell salespeople that their intuition is wrong. And that does happen pretty often. But a more kind of nuanced view on that is that usually your salesperson has a belief that's supported by experiences they've had that might not be generalizable, right? And so I think the way to kind of explain that stuff is to be able to say, well, there's a particular system that works for customers in these areas and doesn't work when the conditions change. And understanding kind of that kind of coupling and how it can tie back to top line revenue, I think is super valuable. And even if you're having that discussion with them, they start to see you as more of a partner. And I think that's an important thing to do, especially if you're in leadership. I think it's essential at that stage. Um, Data needs to be stories, right? Like it's got to be a story because that's what most people will understand.
And if you don't understand the business model, it's really hard to tell any kind of story that is valuable. So I totally
Yeah,
agree with that.
yeah, you're going to be a crappy analyst.
And we've got awesome. Thank you guys so much for the questions. These are great. Next one we got is um, what would you say? I'll add this to the screen. What would you say would protect a data job from recession the most? Data engineering, analytics, data science, or business domain knowledge?
So, in my experience, and again, this is subjective in my experience alone and kind of semi anecdotal, but if you're a good engineer, someone will want to hire you. That's and I hesitate to kind of throw that out there. I mean, I think it's true, but that said, like my own background isn't in engineering. I've had to pick it up over time. But if you look at that kind of that like Venn diagram that people show of like your perfect data scientist, which is like part statistician, part MBA, and part DBA slash engineer, I definitely trend toward like the statistician and MBA side, and the engineering side. I'm good enough, but I couldn't hire myself to be a senior engineer. I'm not at that level. I'm probably more of like a mid level, right? And so I'd still kind of say like in the long term, what's probably best is to do what moves you, what you're passionate about, which I realize is like a hokey, I don't know, YouTube type of answer, but like um, that will tend to be what you're best at in my experience. And if you're passionate and driven in a certain way, that'll show up. And I tend to think that, will likely lead to success in the long term. But that said, in the short term, in a recession, high level engineers are in short supply.
Yeah, and that was true at our last company. We had a group of analysts, and when it came time for layoffs, it definitely had to be in the minds like, okay, who of them is the most technical? And all those other ones that understood really well how to manage our data warehouse on top of their business knowledge, they were the ones that were going to stick around. So
Yeah. Well, and
I totally agree
and
with that.
again, I wish there was some like secret sauce or kind of
Yeah,
like just this is how you keep your job because there are so many factors at play, so many
totally.
variables that I think you just need to think about it differently. I mean, if I had that ability, I totally would have used it a couple times last year because unfortunately, like there were layoffs and the people, that went, in my view, didn't deserve it. They were
Totally.
hardworking, good people.
And another question we have is I'll add this. Do you do any upskill while unemployed, or how do you recommend individuals stay up to date on their skill sets while unemployed? What are the most in demand data analytics skill sets in the current market?
So I think upskilling is important to do all the time. I think kind of the price that we have to pay to be in our industry, one of them. I mean, there's pluses and minuses, right? Like the plus is, comp has gotten a lot better, especially over the last few years. I think in general, if you're like a puzzle solver and if you're someone who is just intellectually curious and kind of driven that way, there's just a lot of rabbit holes that you can kind of dive into and pull out some value, right? But a potential downside, I guess, if you want to call it that, is that you've got to be constantly learning because what the job is today is likely not what the job is going to be in 5 years. And honestly, like if I go back over the course of my career, I mean, my first time doing anything with analytics, was in banking, and it was like diving into grid reports without a summary and trying to figure out how to optimize banking products, right? And then working with the API at the hedge fund, doing kind of SQL and on-prem um, data warehousing stuff with the place after that. moving into cloud stuff and ML and Python. Again, a 5-year period is an eternity. And so, again, I'd always kind of recommend that. So as far as kind of what are the most skill set or the most important skill sets, I think it's important to be proficient in Python. Like Python and SQL are super valuable. I've done a lot of work myself in R and SAS, and there's a decent chance I never will again. It's just kind of the industry has moved on from that, and there are things that you can do in Python environments that are way better. But learning Python, in my view, is easier than understanding why you should do a thing in Python versus doing a different thing, or understanding like how autocorrelation works, and covariance and things like that, right? If you're using like a regression type of mindset, which is understandable, I think regression is super valuable, and for a lot of big picture questions, I think it's still the best tool just because of the nature of the data that you have for a lot of the big stuff. But understanding kind of overfitting, but overfitting at kind of a deeper level, right? Where it's what it does to kind of your predicted outcomes and things like that. The why behind the modeling is super important. And that's also in short supply. If you can kind of be that person who brings that skill set to the table, you can connect a lot of dots for the company. And also, I mean, your coworkers will start to like you more, I think, because you can help them kind of bridge some knowledge gaps and say, hey, this thing you built is really valuable, but let me tell you what it means to the business, right? And once that is kind of communicated, then what they built is even more valuable, right? And they can tune it and make it better and stuff like that. So as far as kind of what I'd say is the most valuable, understanding the why. My formal education, I have an MBA and then a master of applied stats. Um, and the applied stats one in particular, I think, is super useful in terms of just how a sample works and how you build models using incomplete and sparse data, where it makes sense to oversample, what levels of confidence make sense. The idea that we work in certainty, like a lot of people think our job is to predict stuff, which is a little bit true, but I feel like it's more true that what we do is we tell people where there's uncertainty, right? And what are the costs of that uncertainty, and being able to make those connections is super useful. So I'd say, again, learn what's going on behind the scenes. Like if you have a model that's doing a thing, if it's XG boost or, an RNN or whatever, right? Why is it producing what it's producing? When you're taking what's the difference between a boosting model and a random forest, right? Like that kind of gradient approach. The more you kind of understand that stuff, the better you'll be able to put your models together, and the better you'll be able to explain what's happening to the business leaders, who again tend to not come from our background, right? And so you've really got to make that very, very clear and simple. Anyway, I think I said a lot of things there, and that it might have been too many things, but hopefully that
No,
helped.
it's super helpful. We got a question. We spoke about this yesterday, and we weren't going to touch up on it, but it got a few upvotes, so we'll see. What was the best decision you've taken in your career to ensure that you quickly get another job while working at your existing job? And you can go back
Oh,
to something like a few years ago.
well, no. So it's totally networking, right? So my like when I was laid off, kind of it was it wasn't in 2008. Like I was laid off in 2011, but there was still like a lot of shifting. Like the recovery doesn't necessarily happen overnight, right? But the fact that I only knew people in my field that worked in London was a real problem for me. I mean, every application was a cold application, and those are just super hit and miss. I mean, just to kind of like look behind the curtain here, if I post like a senior data scientist job, um, I might get 700 applications, and they're people from all over the place. I don't have someone who's going in to look at every single one necessarily. And even if I do, they don't think about it the same way that I do. And a data science job is kind of nebulous. Like, as far as what you're looking for, it's like, well, it's a whole set of things, but I know I'm not going to get all of them. Right. And so it's like weighting some variables against others, things like that. And so those kind of cold applications, even if you have a great background, are just really, really tough. There's kind of HR software that aggregates things, but even then, the way that it reads your resume, the way that it kind of summarizes stuff isn't nuanced. And so, again, I think the best thing you can do for yourself is to develop a really strong network, which, on that note, add me on LinkedIn.
And I will add that LinkedIn in the announcement for the next question. And yeah, I totally agree with that. Building your network, and a great way to do that is, like, there are so many data communities, not just this one. So Operational Analytics Club is one, but you can find so many through LinkedIn, and that's a great way to find so many people in your space that are doing a similar job or doing a job that you want to do. And also, they post so many job openings that you wouldn't just automatically find on LinkedIn. So that's a great
Yeah.
place to start if you're not involved in any of those.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. I mean, if you get to know people in recruiting at different places, it helps a ton because, again, like, a recruiter especially, their job is to help find you a job, right? And so you can kind of leverage their networks, if you develop a good relationship with them. And honestly, like, that's probably been the thing that um, I really, I mean, time wise, probably getting the stats masters was the thing I spent the most kind of time doing. And obviously that helps a lot, or it makes me credible in certain circles. But, like, knowing people that you can reach out to, who trust you, who enjoy working with you, who feel like you've kind of supported them, and made their lives, their jobs better, super important. And as many of those people as you can kind of work with in your corner, the better.
And we got another one that's a little more specific, not broad, about the recession. What external data should we seek to account for recessions and other economic downturns in our regression models?
I mean, I'd say it depends on your model, and kind of what it is that you're trying to project. So, economic models in general fall very strongly into that, like quadrant 4 or black swan models, where the cost of being wrong can be extreme, and the variable that tends to drive the model is a often an outlier. I mean, just as a for instance, right? Like, everything since 2020 has been a little bit nuts for a whole host of reasons. And while, like, you can look back and say, well, you can predict that a pandemic, could happen because of all these reasons. Predicting when it happens is the important part, and that's the part that's also impossible. And also, at the beginning of 2020, someone who kind of worked in analytics and created projections and forecasts in January of 2020, there was nothing that I took into account that mattered at all relative to the impact of COVID. Um, and there really was no way to predict that at that point. Um, Going back to kind of the Great Recession and things like that as well, right? The domino effect of banks becoming potentially insolvent because all of these assets that they had acquired and valued at a certain level and then used as kind of the background to do other types of activities, right? The rug being pulled out under all of those groups all at once. Um, it's like, I get that if you watch The Big Short or whatever, they kind of make it seem like stuff is deterministic, but the when matters a ton. And I think when people get things like that right, I think they should retire and take all the credit, because if they try to do it again, I don't think they'd be able to, right? So circling back to your question, as far as kind of economic downturns and regression models and stuff like that, in real estate, stuff like the Fed actions and interest rates matters a ton, and that is predictable, right? Like interest rates go up, interest rates go down, interest rates stay the same. That has a very direct impact um, on real estate sales. Like it's not deterministic in like a one for one, but it's pretty damn close. Like as far as stuff that we deal with, it's about as close as you get. But again, the interest rate doesn't necessarily impact everyone else. If I still worked at the bank, the interest rate would matter a lot, because we had fixed rate loans and variable rates on deposit accounts, right? And so if the fixed rate loans were low and deposit accounts went up, that profitability could impact us quite a bit. And so anyway, as far as kind of what you can look at, there's a whole host of stuff on the St. Louis Fed website. It's a fantastic website. Like there are so many data sets that they make kind of like freely available. And I'd look through there and think about the why with your company. What aspects, and kind of the two questions that I would ask with your company. So what impacts whatever it is that you want to project, right, in terms of your like dependent variable? And then also, is this actually predictable? Can I do a forecast for the Fed interest rate that's useful in any way? Or am I better off doing a scenario analysis, or like a hidden Markov or Markov chain Monte Carlo that utilizes different interest rate Markov states and then illustrates the impact of each one? That's kind of how I would think about that. Like, is the economic condition predictable? And if it's not, but it really matters a lot, do a scenario analysis. And there's a decent chance that you'll run into someone who's an executive who really, really wants you to make a prediction. Don't do it. Fight that. If you've worked around me for any length of time, there's a decent chance you've heard kind of my favorite quote, and it's from Voltaire. And it's, uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd one. And in our role, understanding where uncertainty is inescapable and making that damn clear is one of the most important things that we can do. And so in regard to like the regression models and stuff like that, sometimes it makes sense to include a variable. Sometimes it makes sense to use like a Markov state or something like that, and demonstrate the effect under uncertainty, or under different conditions under uncertainty.
And I'm seeing if there's any more questions from the audience. Let me see.
Oh, annual viral outbreak data models. And oh boy, that's a tough one. So it's just I'm looking at the chat here. There was kind of like a follow up here as well. Viral outbreak data models. I mean, the tough thing with that, COVID was such a weird thing because it was so transmissible, right? And so like you would hear things about bird flu and I mean, any number of things that were really severe but didn't have the overall global effect. Like, it's hard for me to imagine, because some viruses matter more than others in terms of how they impact the global economy, and it's not necessarily about lethality, right? And so I don't know. Like, my take on that is that if you add that variable, it would fit to it for COVID, but not necessarily be forward looking, which is the nature of like what a black swan model is. Just kind of a plug here for something that, like, I guess I don't get paid for, but I freaking love it. There was, I recommend reading the book Fooled by Randomness. And I always forget the name of the author, even though like I recommend this book all the freaking time.
I'll add it as an announcement.
Yeah. Okay. By Nassim Nicholas Talib. And he has a follow up book called The Black Swan. And it gets into a lot of like what things are inherently predictable and which things are inherently unpredictable from a really big picture macro point of view. And my take with kind of the viral model is that what actually matters about that is probably unpredictable until it's already started to happen.
And another question I had, so layoffs happen and they're usually not predictable. From my experience, of people that I talked to were like, people did feel blindsided.
Yeah.
Um, what like what have you in like previous times when your company's done layoffs? What trends have you seen that told you like, oh, I think this is gonna happen? Like it might happen to the data team. Again, that's one of those things where you don't know, but
Boy, yeah. I mean, I was blindsided both times, at least in terms of like the severity of it. It's easy to look at kind of KPIs and be able to see business trends going in the wrong direction and be able to say, okay, we're likely. I mean, my last team, we talked pretty openly about the possibility of layoffs because of just what we saw the KPIs doing. But the when and the severity of it, I really didn't predict. And so, yeah, I mean, other than looking at kind of overall business KPIs and understanding that, there's an income statement, and if we're losing money every single month, a business isn't going to exist much longer. That, I mean, definitely kind of, yeah, it's a little bit like if you're driving in the forest and you see those like Smokey the Bear signs, and it's like, fire danger is medium today, or is high today, or is low today. It doesn't mean that there's going to be or not going to be a fire that day, right? It's just a question of like whether or not you should be surprised or how severe it's going to be. And I honestly, at least from my take, from my spot, that's been the best that I could do. Is it's easy to say the danger is high or low or medium, but the timing and the specificity and the severity of it, I don't know.
and we'll finish on something that's upbeat because again, the goal of this is not to scare anybody. The goal is just to learn from Mark from history and to prepare for the current downturn. Hopefully, we don't have to. Um, what what technology or like best practice right now is exciting you, like regardless of the recession? Like what's something that you're eyeing to learn or to put into practice recently?
So some of the just it blows me away how easy and quick it is to do things in like PySpark um, today relative to what it was even like 5 years ago. Like this idea of training and testing models and testing different ones and I mean dealing with the parameters and hyperparameters and all that stuff. It used to be like a weeks long process, and even that was actually pretty quick when you consider what you're doing, right? And now with PySpark, you can jump in and use like auto ML and ML flow and test like 500 models in like an hour, um, and it's insane. So from my standpoint, as far as stuff that I get pretty stoked about, like the reason I got into this stuff and kind of the reason data appealed to me when it kind of sprung up as an industry is that the idea of using math to predict human behavior has always been fascinating to me, even back in the 90s when I started college. I learned Bayesian statistics in the form of mathematical proofs at that point because there wasn't enough data in the world or processing power to actually build a Bayesian model. in real life. And so since then, this idea that the proliferation of data has gotten so large, and things, I mean, stuff has moved, I mean, from kind of on-prem stuff to, I mean, kind of distributed architecture in the cloud that you can spin up in seconds, and then utilizing something like PySpark to be able to wrangle it in using metadata is just absolutely astounding to me. It'll be interesting to see how that, like, with structured data, it, boy, I just can't imagine, and I'm probably wrong, but I can't imagine it getting better for structured data than it is right now. But with things like kind of text data and pictures and stuff like that, it'll be fascinating to see where that goes, in the next 5 years, because I think there's still a lot of opportunity there, in spite of the fact that like it's advanced a ton relative to where it was just kind of a few years ago.
And I did say that was the last question, but Josh from Richmond asked a
Sure.
great one, and I think we can end on this one. So, when a company hiring becomes an internal battle due to limited resources, how do you position new data team hires as essential? I love that question. I'm excited.
So, I mean, if you're waiting for it, like, you need to kind of lay that groundwork before it becomes an internal battle, right? Like, in a lot of respects, it's about kind of delivering value and story over time and building credibility that way. So, like, in a lot of instances, there are things that we have to do as a data team that take a while. Building architecture and some governance stuff, tuning data models, getting a feel for kind of what source data looks like versus how it needs to be consumed, either by a business report or by a model. Those things take a long time. And to business users, they're super boring and they mostly don't ever see the value. And so even though we have to do those things, and even though they're super important for us to do and do generate tons of value in the long run, you can't just wait for that. Like, I think you have to be constantly delivering insights and pushing those out to the business, and also kind of listening to business leaders, what works for them, what doesn't work, what drives them and what doesn't drive them. And it's got to be like a steady drip. If it comes time to kind of choose between limited resources and you haven't done that groundwork, you're going to lose. Because, an engineering group or whatever else can say, we're building whatever thing for the customer or for the operations. And if we haven't demonstrated value as a data team, at a high enough level before that point, it's too late.
Dun, dun, dun. No. Great question, Josh. Great questions from everybody. I really appreciate your participation. Again, this event is recorded and you'll receive it in your inbox. And next week, we have another session of Data in a Downturn with Neil Niclausen. So I will send you information in the email about that. Mark, thank you so much. This was super fun, super insightful, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Yep.
Nice to see you.
See you guys. Thank you.